They thought it was just an ordinary knock. But what happened after they opened the door will make your blood run cold. These chilling stories are so terrifying you'll double-check your locks tonight. Watch until the end if you dare. Natalie adjusted the lighting in her studio, careful to avoid letting the harsh afternoon sun reflect too strongly against the collection of eclectic mirrors and vintage frames she had lined along the walls. Her apartment, an artist's sanctuary with high ceilings and textured walls, served as both her home and creative playground. Today, she was obsessing over her newest acquisition, a gilded antique mirror she had found at a dusty flea market. Its ornate frame was etched with twisting vines that seemed alive and faces so intricate they appeared to shift when glanced at from the corner of the eye. She couldn't explain why she had felt compelled to buy it. Something about its imperfections, the slight warp in the glass, gave it an enigmatic allure she thought her clients would adore. Hours had passed as she photographed the mirror from different angles, experimenting with lighting and textures. The shots weren't coming out quite as she'd hoped. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost didn't notice the knock. Sharp, deliberate. Natalie froze, the soft ambient music playing from her speakers the only sound in the room. She glanced at her watch. 4:47 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. A second knock followed, louder this time. Curiosity stirred uneasily in her chest. Placing her camera down, she walked to the door. Through the peephole, she saw no one. "Natalie, stop being paranoid," she muttered to herself. She turned away, only to be startled by a third knock, closer, heavier, as though whoever was on the other side wasn't using their fist but their entire body. Against her better judgment, Natalie unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. What she saw made her stumble back. It was her. The woman on the threshold looked exactly like Natalie. Same freckled face, dark curls tied back into a loose bun, even the paint-smeared overalls she had put on that morning. The only difference was the expression. Her double stood motionless, her lips stretched into a wide, unnatural grin that didn't match the lifeless look in her eyes. Natalie's throat tightened as she instinctively slammed the door shut and locked it. "What the hell?" she whispered, backing away. She hovered near the door, straining to hear footsteps or movement outside, but the hallway was eerily silent. Peeking through the peephole again, she found the space empty. That night, Natalie couldn't shake the unease. She tried chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a prank, someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to her. As the hours ticked on, she avoided the mirrors in her apartment. She didn't know why, but every time she glanced at one, she felt a prickle of dread, as if she wasn't alone. By 1 a.m., she was ready to pass out from exhaustion. She crawled into bed, ignoring the nagging feeling that she was being watched. When she woke in the morning, her reflection wasn't quite right. Standing before the bathroom mirror, Natalie noticed something off. The woman staring back seemed to delay her movements by a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but once she noticed it, she couldn't unsee it. She leaned closer, examining her reflection's expression. Her own face looked strained, the eyes distant, the corners of her mouth twitching ever so slightly, as if suppressing a smirk. A chill crawled down her spine. She turned away quickly, brushing the moment off as sleep deprivation. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. First, it was small things. She would catch her reflection out of the corner of her eye, moving slightly faster or slower than she did. Then she started seeing the grin. Every time she walked past a mirror, her reflection smiled. Not a polite or friendly smile, but the same twisted grin she had seen on her double at the door. Natalie began covering her mirrors with sheets. She shoved smaller ones into closets and turned others toward the wall. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the creeping sensation that the smile was following her. Her paranoia reached a boiling point when her best friend, Julia, came over for coffee. "You look exhausted," Julia said, eyeing Natalie as they sat at her cluttered kitchen table. "Just busy," Natalie lied, swirling a spoon aimlessly in her cup. "Is everything okay? You've been dodging my calls all week." Natalie hesitated. She wanted to tell Julia everything but didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. She forced a smile and changed the subject. When Julia excused herself to use the bathroom, Natalie remained at the table, her thoughts racing. Minutes passed, then longer. "Julia?" she called. No answer. Natalie walked to the bathroom door and knocked softly. "Julia, are you okay?" When the door creaked open, the room was empty. The faint smell of Julia's perfume lingered, but there was no sign of her. Natalie's stomach twisted. Her gaze darted to the uncovered mirror above the sink. Her reflection wasn't smiling. It was screaming. By nightfall, Natalie had barricaded herself in her room. Every surface that could hold a reflection had been removed or hidden, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She sat curled up on her bed, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. She debated calling the police but couldn't bring herself to explain what was happening. How could she? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the bedroom door. Natalie's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she stared at the handle, willing it not to move. Another knock, louder this time. "Who's there?" she whispered. No response. Slowly, she reached for the baseball bat she kept under her bed. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, as though it were taunting her. Gathering her courage, Natalie flung open the door and raised the bat, only to find her bedroom mirror leaning against the wall. It wasn't supposed to be there. Her reflection stared back, grinning from ear to ear, and then it moved. Natalie's breath hitched as the mirror leaned against her bedroom door quivered faintly, the surface rippling like a disturbed pond. Her reflection on its surface was unnatural. Not a simple mimic but alive, predatory, grinning so wide it seemed her jaw might unhinge. The golden frame, ornate and twisted, seemed to pulse in time with her racing heart. Her reflection stepped forward, its movements fluid yet wrong, its body rippling faintly as though barely contained by the glass. Natalie stumbled back, her fingers trembling as they reached for the door. The reflection didn't follow her. It pushed itself forward, pressing against the glass until it seeped out of the mirror like liquid. It stood there, glistening under the faint light of the bedside lamp. Its head tilted slightly as it stared at her. The grin on its face remained unchanged, but the rest of its features seemed blurred, like an image out of focus. Natalie's legs gave out, and she hit the floor. The thing didn't move toward her. Instead, it turned and walked into the hallway, its footsteps strangely silent against the creaky wooden floor. Minutes passed, maybe hours, before Natalie found the courage to move. She crawled toward the open door, clutching the baseball bat like a lifeline. The apartment beyond was cloaked in darkness, the lights she had left on now extinguished. She crept forward, the bat raised, her breath shallow. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang. In the studio, the gilded mirror glowed faintly, casting a sickly light over the room. Natalie froze at the threshold. The doppelganger stood before the mirror, gazing at its surface. The light from the mirror twisted the shadows of the room, making them dance unnaturally across the walls. Her frames, her prized collection of vintage and antique mirrors, were no longer still. Each surface shimmered, and in every one, Natalie saw herself. Her reflections weren't normal. They writhed, twisted, their faces smeared into grotesque shapes. Some grinned like the doppelganger, others cried black tears, and still others looked at her with hollow, empty eyes. Natalie felt her knees weaken. The gilded mirror pulsed, and the twisted reflections reached toward her from their frames, their distorted arms stretching as though trying to break free. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet remained planted. Slowly, she raised the bat, The doppelganger didn't react. Its head tilted slightly as if in amusement. With a desperate cry, Natalie swung at the mirror closest to her. The glass shattered, shards scattering across the floor in a glittering spray. The reflection inside dissolved into a blur of light and shadow before vanishing entirely. For a moment, Natalie felt a flicker of hope. But then the room responded. Every mirror in the apartment began to vibrate violently. Cracks spiderwebbed across their surfaces as though the shattered mirror had sent a ripple of destruction through them all. The gilded mirror pulsed brighter, and Natalie felt a force pulling her toward it. She resisted, clawing at the doorframe as her feet slid across the floor. The doppelganger finally moved, stepping aside with a mocking grace to let the mirror take her. The pull grew stronger, and Natalie screamed as her grip faltered. She fell through. The world on the other side was cold, suffocating. Glass shards floated around her in an endless void, reflecting fragments of her apartment. Her bed, her camera, her collection of frames, all warped and distorted. Natalie turned, desperate for some sense of direction, and saw her reflection in every shard. They stared back at her, moving on their own. One by one, the reflections began to move closer, their faces stretching into grotesque shapes. Some had too many eyes, others too many mouths. All of them bore that same malicious grin. The shards swirled faster, their edges glinting like knives. Natalie tried to run, but there was no ground beneath her, no gravity to anchor her. The reflections closed in, their whispers clawing at the edges of her mind. She screamed. In her apartment, the gilded mirror fell silent. The light faded from its surface, leaving the room bathed in darkness. The doppelganger stood in the center of the studio, watching the last shimmer of light disappear. Slowly, it turned toward the front door. Its grin widened, and it stepped forward, its movements fluid, confident. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. The sound reverberated, followed by a heavy silence. Sophia turned the key in the lock with a satisfying click, pushing open the door to her new home. The scent of fresh paint and pine would greeted her as she stepped inside. It was everything she dreamed of. A quaint cottage on the edge of a dense forest, far from the noise and chaos of the city. Here she could finally breathe. The house had a charm that felt timeless. White clapboard siding, a porch with a swing, and windows framed with vibrant blue shutters. It was remote, but not isolated. There were a few other houses scattered along the dirt road. Unpacking was slow but satisfying. By evening, Sophia was sipping a glass of wine on the porch, gazing at the stars and listening to the soft rustling of the trees. It felt like the start of a new chapter, one where peace and quiet would finally be the norm. She went to bed that night feeling more content than she had in years. The first whisper came just past midnight. Sophia stirred in her sleep, her mind half registering the faint sound. It was soft, like the rustle of leaves carried on a breeze. "Lock the doors," the voice whispered, barely audible. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding foolish in the stillness of the house. No answer. The room was dark, the corners swallowed in shadow. She shook her head and lay back down. It was nothing, a trick of her imagination in an unfamiliar place. The whisper came again. "Lock the doors." Sophia bolted upright, her pulse quickening. This time she was certain she'd heard it. She grabbed her phone and flicked on its flashlight, sweeping the narrow beam around the room. Nothing. "Lock the doors," the voice repeated, insistent now. Sophia's stomach tightened. She got out of bed and checked the front and back doors. Both were locked. She walked to each window, testing the latches. Everything was secure. The whisper didn't return, but she slept fitfully for the rest of the night. The whispers didn't stop. Over the next few days, Sophia heard them at odd moments. While she was washing dishes, a faint voice drifted in through the open kitchen window, Close the shutters. While she was folding laundry, the whispers came from the hallway. Lock the back door. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. But as the warnings became more specific, her unease grew. The voices never sounded threatening, just urgent, as though trying to protect her from something she couldn't see. And then came the tapping. Sophia was sitting in her living room, scrolling through her phone, when she heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap against the glass. She looked up, expecting to see a branch swaying against the window, but there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It came from every window at once, a chorus of sharp, deliberate knocks. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as she walked to the nearest window, peering out into the darkness. The forest beyond the yard was still, bathed in moonlight. A whisper slid through the air behind her. Don't open it. Sophia's neighbor, a middle-aged man named Carl, stopped by the next day while she was tending to the overgrown garden. Leaning casually against the fence, he commented on how she seemed to be settling in, and she nodded, hesitating before asking if he had ever noticed anything strange at night. At first, Carl appeared amused by the question, but when she mentioned hearing whispers, his smile faded. He glanced toward the forest, then back at her with an expression that sent a chill up her spine. There had been stories, he explained, incidents, where people claimed to hear voices urging them to lock their doors or stay inside. Some listened to the warnings while others didn't. When she asked what happened to those who ignored them, Carl didn't provide details. He simply advised her to keep everything locked at night and not to answer if she heard knocking. Sophia felt a growing unease as he walked away without another word, his silhouette disappearing down the dirt road. That night, she locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tightly shut, and double-checked every latch. The house, bathed in the warm glow of a single lamp, felt smaller than before. She tried to reassure herself that Carl's warnings were nothing more than small-town superstition. Stories designed to explain creaking floorboards and the strange sounds of the forest at night. She was still repeating that thought to herself when the scratching began. At first, it was faint, barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. It sounded like the claws of an animal dragging against wood. She dismissed it, telling herself it was probably a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature. But then the sound moved. From the front door to the back, then along the windows, the scratching grew louder and more deliberate. It seemed to circle the house, as though searching for a way inside. Sophia pressed her hands over her ears, desperate to block out the noise, but it didn't help. The whispers had returned, slipping into her thoughts and rising in intensity. They filled every corner of the house, their tones more frantic than ever. The scratching turned to pounding, each blow rattling the doors and shaking the hinges. Sophia's heart raced as she stood frozen in the center of the living room. The whispers grew sharper, urging her not to open the door, not to let whatever was outside come in. She clutched a flashlight, inching toward the front door despite the pounding that made her whole body tremble. The noise was relentless, vibrating through the floorboards and into her very bones. As her hand reached for the handle, the whispers surged, their intensity exploding into a deafening roar that seemed to come from within her skull. Her hand froze, trembling in midair. The pounding ceased. Sophia stood still, her breath caught in her throat, listening to the silence that followed. It was heavy, almost oppressive, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Then, breaking the stillness, came a single, deliberate knock. The single knock lingered in the air like an echo, its deliberate cadence pulling Sophia forward. Her flashlight flickered, the weak beam casting jittery shadows across the room. She couldn't explain the pull, curiosity, fear, or something darker, but her feet moved as if guided by unseen hands. The whispers surged again, pressing against her mind with their urgent rhythm. They crowded her thoughts, swirling and rising, louder and more fragmented. It was no longer a single voice but a chorus, desperate and commanding. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob. The air around her felt charged, heavy with expectation. The knock came again. Sophia hesitated, her grip tightening. A part of her screamed to pull away, to retreat into the safety of her locked house. But another part, more primal, more reckless, needed to know. With a sharp inhale, she turned the lock and opened the door. The night outside was still, almost unnaturally so. The forest beyond the yard loomed inky and silent, its edges blurred by the faint silver light of the moon. First, she saw nothing. The porch was empty, the swing motionless. But then the air shifted. Something stepped into view, emerging from the shadows. It was massive, towering over the frame of the door, yet its form was undefined. Its body was shapeless, a swirling mass of darkness that writhed and shifted like smoke caught in a storm. At its center were two hollow voids, deep and black, where eyes might have been. Sophia froze, every muscle locking in place. The thing didn't move closer, but its presence pressed against her, suffocating and cold. The whispers returned, louder now, no longer contained by her mind. They filled the air around her, overlapping and crashing into one another like waves. For a moment, Sophia thought she could hear herself among them, her own voice, pleading and broken, warning her to run. She tried to close the door, but the thing moved then, a tendril of darkness slipping forward and wedging itself into the gap. It wasn't solid, but it carried weight, forcing the door open inch by inch. Sophia stumbled back, her flashlight falling from her hand. The shadows spilled into the house, spreading across the floor like ink. They climbed the walls, coiling around the furniture and swallowing the light. Sophia retreated, her back pressing against the far wall as the room grew colder. The figure loomed in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The house trembled as the whispers turned to screams. The voices were everywhere now, rising and falling in a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. Sophia clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they tore through her like claws. The shadows reached her feet first, curling around her ankles and dragging her forward. She kicked and fought, but there was no escaping the pull. As the darkness enveloped her, the screams grew louder, sharper, until they were no longer coming from the air but from her own throat. She felt herself being consumed, her body dissolving into the blackness. Memories flashed before her eyes. Her childhood home, the laughter of her friends, the life she had tried to leave behind. They fractured and blurred, replaced by the endless void that surrounded her. Sophia's voice joined the whispers, first a faint murmur, then a desperate plea. Her final thought, before the last piece of herself was swallowed, was that she should have never opened the door. The house stood silent. The darkness receded, pulling itself back through the open door and into the forest. The porch swing creaked softly, swaying in a breeze that didn't exist. Inside, the air was still and heavy, the echoes of the whispers lingering like smoke. The gilded moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating a space that was now lifeless. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep within the shadows, came a whisper. It repeated itself, again and again, growing louder and more insistent. "Lock the doors." The hotel had been grand once. Its sprawling facade, now weathered and faded, stood stubbornly against time at the edge of an empty highway. Eleanor had found it by chance, or perhaps fate, during one of her late-night drives to escape the suffocating reminders of Greg's absence. She'd taken a room on the top floor, one with a cracked window overlooking a barren stretch of land. The wallpaper inside the room had peeled at the corners, and the scent of musty carpet lingered in the air. Yet, its emptiness offered her a strange solace. No one came here anymore, Not in years, the concierge had told her with a faint, almost suspicious smile. The quiet should have been comforting, but it had an edge to it, sharpening as the hours dragged into nights. The empty halls swallowed sound, and the faint buzz of the overhead lights in the corridor seemed almost alive, vibrating with a frequency that set her teeth on edge. Eleanor didn't mind the eerie surroundings, though. After Greg's death, she found herself numb to most fears. The weight of guilt she carried made anything else, ghosts, solitude, silence, feel inconsequential. On the seventh night, as she lay awake in the creaking bed, Eleanor heard the first sound. A knock, faint but deliberate, echoed through the room. She sat up, her body tense. The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice calling her name. Her breath hitched as she froze in place, listening intently. The voice was muffled but unmistakable. Greg's. The sound seemed to come from the hallway outside her door, soft yet insistent, as though he were standing just beyond the threshold. She gripped the edge of the bed, her mind reeling. Couldn't be. She had buried him, stood by his casket, felt the weight of finality pressing down on her chest. But the voice continued, coaxing her with the warm cadence she had once found so comforting. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she rose to her feet, her bare toes brushing the cold floor. The hotel room, dimly lit by the flickering bulb above, seemed to grow smaller as the voice filled the space. She stepped cautiously toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. Her trembling hand reached for the knob but hesitated. This was grief playing its cruel games again, she told herself. It wasn't real. But the voice spoke again, softer now, pleading with her. He was outside, he insisted, waiting for her to open the door. Eleanor took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself. Her mind churned, pulling her between reality and memory. She remembered the feel of his hand slipping from hers as the paramedics worked to revive him. The sterile chill of the hospital room. The unbearable silence of the days that followed. Outside, the knocking grew louder, more frantic. His voice cracked as he called her name, tinged with the same urgency she had heard the night he died. She pressed her back against the far wall, squeezing her eyes shut. The room seemed to close in around her as she heard it, the faint melody of their song. It was Greg's voice, humming the tune they had danced to at their wedding. Her chest tightened as memories of that night flooded back. She could almost see him smiling down at her, his hand warm against her back as they swayed to the music. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her hands clutching the sides of her head. The song wove through the air, mingling with the sound of his voice as he spoke of the promises they'd made, the life they'd planned. Her resolve faltered. What if it was him? What if he had somehow found his way back to her, defying death itself? The laughter came next. It was soft at first, a low chuckle that sent a chill racing down her spine, but it grew louder, sharper, until it filled the room. It was Greg's laugh, but it sounded wrong, hollow and jagged, as though filtered through something inhuman. The voice outside changed, its tone hardening, demanding that she open the door. Eleanor crawled back toward the bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The walls of the room seemed to press closer, the air thick with the weight of the impossible. Her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the mattress. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it made her ears ring. Then came a single knock, deliberate and loud, shaking the door on its hinges. Eleanor stared at the door, her breath shallow. The room seemed frozen in time, the air thick and still as Eleanor stared at the door. The single knock lingered in her mind, louder than any sound she had ever heard. She could almost feel the vibration of it, resonating through her chest. Her rational mind screamed for her to stay away, to retreat to the corner of the room and wait for the thing outside to leave. But her heart, raw with guilt and longing, pulled her forward. What if it was him? What if the impossible had happened? The doorknob rattled faintly. The voice, his voice, called out again, softer this time, almost broken. It begged her not to leave him outside, not to abandon him. Eleanor's knees wavered as she stepped closer to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob, trembling. She told herself it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. But then came the sound of his humming again, the melody so perfectly familiar that her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't resist anymore. With a deep inhale, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway beyond was dark, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering sconces. At first, Eleanor saw nothing but shadows. Then something shifted at the edge of her vision. He was standing there, just beyond the threshold. It was Greg, or what was left of him. His figure was gaunt, his skin pallid and stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were sunken and dull, like empty sockets that somehow still managed to see her. His lips pulled back into a grin that was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp. Eleanor stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. But Greg stepped forward, his movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet on fraying strings. The scent of earth and decay followed him, wafting into the room and curling around her like a suffocating fog. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another in a panicked spiral. This couldn't be Greg, couldn't be real. But the way he looked at her, with an expression that teetered between love and malice, sent a shiver down her spine. He reached for her, his hand trembling as though struggling to remember how to move. The voice that had called her moments ago now whispered her name, soft and tender, as though nothing had changed. Eleanor's knees buckled as she collapsed onto the floor. He knelt beside her, his cold, clammy hands brushing against her skin. Despite every instinct screaming for her to pull away, she didn't move. He leaned in close, his breath icy against her ear as he spoke. His words were calm, almost loving, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. He had come back for her, he said. It was time for them to be together again. A sob escaped her lips as the memories came flooding back. She had failed him. She had hesitated when he needed her most, and now this thing was all that remained. Greg's voice cracked as he spoke again, his tone shifting from tender to accusatory. He told her she had left him alone, abandoned him to the darkness. His whispers grew harsher, more fragmented, echoing off the walls until they sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once. The room darkened, the shadows deepening until the flickering lamp above was snuffed out entirely. Greg's form seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness, his features becoming less human with each passing second. Eleanor tried to crawl backward, but his grip tightened on her arms, his touch like ice burning against her skin. He pulled her closer, his hollow eyes staring deep into hers. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a vortex. She could hear her own voice among them, faint but unmistakable, begging herself to run. Greg's lips parted in a grotesque smile as he leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers. His voice softened again, dripping with something almost like affection. He told her it was over, that she didn't need to fight anymore. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, suffocating and final. Eleanor's body went limp as the cold seeped into her bones. She felt herself being pulled into him, her surroundings dissolving into a void of darkness. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and then, as suddenly as they had come, they stopped. The room was empty. The door hung open, swaying gently on its hinges. The light in the hallway flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Somewhere in the depths of the hotel, faint and distant, a voice began to call. It was soft at first, but its tone carried the same desperate edge that had once pulled Eleanor to the door. Another occupant, another soul, and Eleanor's voice joined the whispers.